Hey, my name is Gavin Cole. I'm 29, and I make things out of wood for a living. I work in a small shop just outside Portland, Oregon, tucked behind an old feed store that still smells like hay in the summer. Most days I build tables, bookshelves, custom doors, and the occasional bed frame for people who want something that lasts longer than a few seasons. It's quiet work. The kind where the only voices you hear are the ones inside your own head, and even those tend to shut up after a while if you let the sawdust settle. After my last relationship ended a year ago, I stopped looking for anything that required effort. Not because I was bitter, just tired. People say time heals, but what they don't say is that sometimes it just teaches you how to live with the scar. I got good at living with mine. Mornings at the shop, afternoons brushing sawdust off my jeans, evenings at Bluebird Cafe with black coffee and a burger extra pickles. Simple, predictable, safe. Then Mark called. Friday night, Oak and Finch. Just dinner, no big deal. I should have known better. Every time someone says no big deal, it usually means they've already decided what's best for you. I showed up at 7. The restaurant had that warm, low lighting that makes everyone look a little softer than they really are. Mark was already there with his wife, 2 other couples, and one empty seat next to a. She wore a deep blue dress, hair pulled back low, and had the kind of face that looked like it had learned to be careful. On the table in front of her sat a small notebook and her phone open to a notes app. She wasn't scrolling. She was watching the room. I hadn't even pulled out the chair when I felt it, the shift in the air, the quick glances, the suppressed smiles. Mark stood up too fast, like a game show host who just spotted his next contestant. "Gavin, this is Elena Brooks," he said. "We thought you two might hit it off." The way he said it told me everything. This wasn't a blind date. This was a setup with an audience. Elena looked at me. She smiled politely, then raised her hands and signed. "Nice to meet you." I froze for half a second. Not because I was uncomfortable, because I wasn't expecting. My mother lost most of her hearing after a car accident when I was 8. She taught me basic ASL before she taught me how to swing a hammer. I hadn't used it in years, but some things stick. Muscle memory, I guess. Or maybe heart memory. I lifted my hands and signed back, slow and deliberate. "Very nice to meet you. I'm Gavin." The entire table went quiet. Mark blinked like I'd just derailed his entire evening. "You know sign language?" I spoke and signed at the same time so she could read my lips if she wanted. My mom's hard of hearing she taught me when I was a kid. A small, real smile touched the corner of her mouth. The first one I'd seen all night. I sat down beside her. "Well," I said, looking around the table, "at least there's one person here I haven't heard tell the same 3 stories twice already." Elena laughed. Not out loud. Her laugh didn't have sound, but her shoulders shook and her eyes crinkled. I knew right then I'd done something right. For the first 20 minutes, the table tried to act normal and failed miserably. Everyone kept glancing at us like they were waiting for a reaction. Conversation started, stalled, restarted. People laughed too loudly at nothing. It felt like Elena and I were the evening's entertainment. Elena stayed calm. She read lips well, but when too many voices overlapped, she glanced at me. I signed summaries for her when I could. She thanked me with a look. Bit by bit, I learned things. She was a pediatric nurse at St. Mary's. Lost her hearing at 15 after meningitis. Loved dogs, hated cilantro, collected old books, and had a dry sense of humor that snuck up on you. She told me about a 4-year-old patient who once called her stethoscope a monster listening machine. I actually laughed. That's when Brad leaned back in his chair, smirked, and asked the question that changed everything. "So, Gavin, be honest. Is she really your type?" The table froze. Elena's hand stilled on her water glass. I saw it happen. The way her fingers tightened until her knuckles went white. She didn't duck her head. She kept her spine straight, but something in her eyes dimmed just for a second. That was the moment I understood what tonight really was. They hadn't just set us up. They wanted to watch how I'd react to being paired with a deaf woman. I set my glass down slowly, then I looked at Brad. No. The silence was absolute. Elena dropped her gaze. I turned to her so she could see my mouth clearly and signed every word. She's smarter, warmer, and more interesting than most people I've ever sat next to. I looked back at Brad. If you're asking whether I usually get set up with someone this incredible, the answer is no. And if you're asking anything else, don't. Elena lifted her eyes to mine. The look she gave me wasn't just polite anymore. It was softer, sharper, like she was seeing me for the first time that night. She signed slowly. That was unexpected. I signed back. Good unexpected or the kind where you leave through the back door? She studied me for a long moment, then signed. Ask me after dessert. And for the first time all evening, I forgot the rest of the table was even there. We ate in a strange kind of peace after that. The others tried to steer the conversation back to safe topics, but the damage was done. Mark kept shooting me guilty looks. Brad stayed quiet. Elena and I didn't talk much with our voices, but our hands moved in small, private exchanges under the table's edge. When dessert came, she ordered chocolate cake and 2 forks without asking. I signed. Confident. She signed back. You defended my honor. You earned the right to share cake. I raised an eyebrow. Is that a rule? Starting tonight, it is. I smiled. She smiled back. Not the polite one. The real one. When the check came, everyone moved a little too quickly to leave. Coats were pulled on, phones were checked. Excuses were made about early mornings and babysitters. One by one, they filtered out into the rain until only Mark remained, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like a kid who'd been caught doing something he knew was wrong. Gavin, can I talk to you for a second? Elena started to step back, giving us space, but I shook my head. No, she stays. Mark looked even more uncomfortable than before. I didn't mean for it to get weird. Elena let out a small, soundless laugh and signed. I translated without hesitation. She says that's a very impressive sentence in the worst possible way. Mark flushed. I just thought you two might get along. I looked at him steadily. The part where you thought we might get along might actually be true. The problem is you invited us like we were people, then sat back like we were entertainment. He opened his mouth, closed it again. For a moment he just stood there, rain dripping from the awning onto his shoulders. Brad was out of line. Brad was out of line, I agreed. But the whole table sat there waiting to see how I'd react. That's the part that's harder to forgive. Mark dropped his eyes to Elena, signed again, slower this time. I waited until she finished before I spoke. She doesn't need anyone punished, I said. She just needs fewer people who confuse cruelty with honesty. Mark was quiet for a long time. When he finally looked up, his face was tired. I'm sorry, Elena. She studied him for a moment, then signed. I accept. But that doesn't mean it I repeated the words. Mark nodded once, like he understood he didn't deserve anything more than that, then turned and walked out into the rain without another word. And then it was just the two of the restaurant door closed behind the last of them. The only sounds left were the soft hiss of rain on the sidewalk and the distant hum of traffic. Elena stood with her arms crossed, watching the water run along the curb in thin silver ribbons. The blue of her dress looked darker in the low light, almost black. You okay? I asked, signing at the same time. She glanced at me, mouth curving in that tired, knowing way. That question has been very popular tonight. But you still haven't answered it. She was quiet for a while. I didn't push. Some silences need room to breathe. Eventually she signed, her hands moving with a kind of careful honesty I was starting to recognize. I'm fine. And I'm tired of always having to be fine in rooms that want me to fall apart. The words landed somewhere deep in my chest. I didn't offer the usual empty comfort. I just stood there beside her, letting the truth sit between us. Like after a minute, she turned slightly toward me. I had a whole speech prepared. For Brad? For all of them. It was going to be sharp, maybe a little long. Why didn't you say it? She looked at me then, really looked, and the corner of her mouth lifted. You ruined it. I smiled despite myself. I'm sorry. No, you're not. She laughed again, that silent laugh that moved through her shoulders and lit up her eyes. For a second, the heaviness of the night lifted, just a little. She signed. You asked earlier, good unexpected, or the kind I should escape through the back door? I took my time answering. I wanted her to see that I was thinking about it, not just saying what she wanted to hear. Good unexpected. She studied my face like she was checking for cracks in the words. Then she signed, slower, more deliberate. Good. Because I was hoping you'd ask me out when there isn't an audience watching. My pulse kicked hard. I felt it in my throat. I lifted my hands. Elena Brooks, would you like to go out with me on purpose? She glanced through the restaurant window. Inside, the last of our group was still lingering near the bar, pretending not to look our way. She watched them for a moment, then turned back to me. Yes, but not tonight. Tonight's been contaminated. Fair. I want to know what this feels like when no one's watching. That answer told me more about her than anything else she could have said. She wasn't swept up in the drama of the moment. She wanted something real enough to survive outside other people's eyes, something that could stand on its own 2 feet. I signed. Saturday? Bluebird Cafe? She shook her head. Bookstore first, then coffee. If you take me somewhere boring, I'll have to reassess you. Pressure. Standard. We stood there a little longer, neither of us in any hurry to leave. The rain had softened into a steady, gentle rhythm. Somewhere down the block a car drove slowly past, headlights sweeping across the wet street like slow-moving ghosts. Elena's hands stayed tucked inside the sleeves of her coat, but her eyes stayed on mine, steady and open in a way that made something in my chest loosen. I thought about all the nights I'd spent alone in my apartment after work, eating leftover pizza and pretending I was fine with the quiet. I thought about how easy it would have been to just nod along with the table tonight, to laugh at Brad's joke and let Elena carry the weight of everyone's discomfort by herself. I thought about how close I'd come to being that guy, but I wasn't. And standing here now, with rain in the air and this woman beside me who had every reason to walk away and hadn't, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real, careful, slightly terrifying hope. Elena shifted her weight, then signed one last thing before we finally stepped out from under the awning. Don't be late Saturday, I smiled. She gave me one last look. Soft, a little amused, and something else I couldn't quite name yet. Then turned and walked toward the parking lot. I watched her go, the blue of her dress disappearing into the rain, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was just going through the motions of another night. I felt like something had actually begun, and I had every intention of showing up for it. Saturday arrived slower than I expected. I changed shirts twice before I left the house. The first one made me look like I was trying too hard. The second one made me look like I'd just rolled out of the workshop, which wasn't entirely untrue. In the end, I settled on a clean gray button-down and jeans that didn't have sawdust in the cuffs. I told myself I wasn't nervous, I was lying. Elena was already waiting in front of the bookstore when I got there. She wore a rust-colored sweater and jeans, hair loose around her shoulders. No fancy dress, no heavy makeup, just her. And somehow that made her look even better than she had at the restaurant. She signed as soon as I reached her. Before we start, I judge men by which section of the bookstore they head to first. I signed back. Dangerous. Very dangerous. We spent nearly 2 hours inside. She pulled books off shelves and told me which covers were lying, which authors were overpraised, and which ones you should read when you needed to cry but didn't want to admit it. I led her to the woodworking and design section and showed her books on furniture making, small architecture, and the quiet art of building things that last. I told her how a good table isn't just about looking nice. It has to survive family dinners, late night conversations, and years of hands resting on its surface. Elena ran her fingers along the spine of one book. You talk about objects like they have souls, I signed, and you speak with your hands like you're drawing on air. She looked at me. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed genuinely caught off guard. After the bookstore, we walked to Bluebird Cafe. I ordered black coffee. She ordered hot chocolate because coffee kept her awake at night. We sat at a corner table near the window and talked about my mother. I told her how Mom lost most of her hearing after the accident when I was 8, and how I used to watch people talk to her like she was slow just because she couldn't hear them clearly. Elena's hand slowed. People often confuse not hearing with not understanding. I signed back, and silence with emptiness. She studied me for a long moment. Did your mother teach you that? She said, silence isn't empty. It's just full in a different way. Elena looked down at her mug. When she lifted her eyes again, they were shining. I like your mother already. We started meeting every Wednesday at Bluebird after that. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we sat side by side with our hands close, but not quite touching, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. She told me about the hospital, about the kids who were terrified of needles but still tried to smile for her. I told her about the shop, about the customer who wanted a table which led to 3 days of the entire crew arguing about whether a table could aesthetically fly. She laughed with her shoulders, with her eyes, with her hands. I started learning more sign language on my own, not just the basics anymore. I wanted to understand her without making her carry the entire conversation. A month later, she took me to the park with her rescue dog, Milo. He was a golden retriever with one floppy ear and the personality of a cheerful old man. We walked along the path where maple leaves had already started to fall. Elena signed that Milo had been abandoned and was still afraid of loud noises, even though he couldn't hear them well himself. I signed back. Maybe fear doesn't always need ears. She looked at me, then nodded. Later that week, she came to the workshop. I showed her how to cut a dovetail joint, the kind that doesn't need nails or screws. 2 pieces of wood holding each other by the shape of their own edges. If you cut it right, the harder you pull, the tighter it gets. Elena touched the joint with her fingertips. Like trust. You can't always see it, but it holds everything together. That was the day I knew I was falling for her. Not because I defended her that first night. Not because she needed me. But because when I was with her, the world slowed down enough for me to see things clearly again. But life doesn't let good things stay simple for long. One Saturday afternoon in the park, we were signing about how Milo had failed spectacularly at chasing a squirrel, when a group of teenagers nearby started watching us. At first, it was just curiosity. Then, one of them began mimicking Elena's signs, exaggerated, clumsy, face twisted in mockery. The others burst out laughing. One of them called out loud enough for half the park to hear. What's she saying? Blah, blah with her hands? Elena froze. Her hands dropped. Her shoulders pulled in. Milo whined softly and pressed against her leg. Something hot and sharp flared in my chest. But I didn't yell. I walked straight over to them and signed, slow and clear, every movement deliberate. Different doesn't make people weak. Stupid does. They didn't understand the signs, but they understood my face. One of them muttered something about me being too serious, and they walked away, still laughing, but quieter now. I turned back. Elena was still standing where I'd left her, eyes red but dry. She hadn't cried. She signed. You didn't have to do that. I signed immediately. Yes, I did. No one gets to make you smaller. Elena looked at me for a long time. It wasn't a polite hug. It was the kind of hug that said she'd been carrying too much alone for too long and had finally found somewhere safe to set it down. I held her there in the middle of the park, surrounded by the sound of dry leaves under our feet and a world that still hadn't learned how to be gentle. After that day, whatever had been growing between us stopped being something tentative. We kept meeting at Bluebird every Wednesday. We started leaving little notes for each other on napkins, hers in careful handwriting, mine sometimes in crooked signs I'd practiced at home. She came back to the workshop a few more times and let me teach her how to sand wood without leaving scratches. I went with her to the animal shelter where she volunteered and watched her sit on the floor with a terrified beagle until the dog finally crawled into her lap. One evening, after we'd been seeing each other for almost 2 months, we were sitting on a bench near the river when she signed something I wasn't ready for. "You make it easy to forget I'm different." I signed back without hesitation. "You're not different. You're just you." She shook her head, smiling a little sadly. "That's what people say when they're trying to be kind." "But I am different, and I need you to see that." "I see it. I just don't think it makes you less." Elena looked at our joined hands for a long moment. Then she signed very slowly. "Don't fall in love with the version of me that's easy. Fall in love with the version that needs extra light in the dark and still sometimes gets tired of explaining herself." I lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Too late. She blinked fast, like she hadn't expected that answer. We sat there until the streetlights came on, hands still linked, neither of us in a rush to leave. The river moved quietly beside us. Milo slept at our feet. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and I had no intention of letting go. It was raining again the night everything changed. We went back to Bluebird Cafe on a Thursday because Elena had a long shift and wanted something familiar. The place was half empty, the way it always was on weeknights. Warm yellow light pooled on the tables. Sarah, the owner, gave us our usual spot without asking. Table 6. The one near the window where we'd first sat after that disastrous dinner. I'd been carrying the small. It was a scrap of maple no bigger than a matchbox, sanded smooth. On the surface, I'd carved 2 clean ASL signs. Family and trust. The letters weren't perfect, but the meaning was. I'd worked on it late at night in the shop after she'd gone home, trying to get the curves right. I set it on the table between us. Elena looked at the carving, then up at me with a question in her eyes. I signed. For you. For us. You made this? I nodded. Why these 2 words? My hands felt unsteady, but I signed clearly. Because you're not just someone I meet for coffee every week anymore. You're the place I want to come back to. Elena went very still. Then she signed, slower than usual. Are you sure? Before I could answer, she continued. I will be a different kind of wife. The word wife hung between us, heavier than any sound in the cafe. She looked down at her hands. I won't hear you call from the other room. I might not hear a baby cry if we have children one day. I'll need flashing lights, vibrating alarms, extra ways to know what's happening. There will be parties where I get tired of reading lips. There will be days I don't want to explain myself to strangers anymore. There will be times you'll have to repeat things, be patient, live in a world that doesn't work the same way for everyone else. I listened to every movement of her hands and realized what she was really saying. She wasn't testing whether I could handle her. She was terrified that one day I would wake up and decide she was too much. I placed my hand over hers on the table. Then I signed with my free hand, slow and steady. Different doesn't make you less. It makes you the only one. Elena lifted her eyes to mine. I spoke out loud so she could read my lips. I don't want a perfect life. I want a real one. With you. Her eyes filled. She didn't cry the way people do in movies. No dramatic sobs, no shaking shoulders. Just quiet tears that slipped down her cheeks while she kept looking at me like she was afraid I might disappear if she blinked. She signed, hands trembling slightly. I'm scared. I signed back. So am I, but I want this. That night, she didn't kiss me. She just held my hand under the table, fingers laced tight like she was anchoring herself to something solid for the first time in years. When we finally left, the rain had turned heavy. I held my jacket over both our heads as we ran to the car. She laughed when I fumbled the keys and dropped them. I bent to pick them up, and she kept the carved piece of wood safe in her pocket like it was something breakable and precious. After that night, we started talking about the future in small, careful pieces. A house with a flashing doorbell. A kitchen big enough for me to cook badly and for her to complain about it. A reading nook by the window. A small workshop out back. A place where we could sign to each other without worrying who was watching. But the real test was still waiting. Mark texted me a week later. The group wanted to meet Elena again, to apologize properly this time. I asked her. She thought about it for 2 days before she signed. I don't need them to like me, but I want them to look at what they did. So we went back to Oak and Finch on a quiet Tuesday evening. Elena sat beside me, spine straight, no hesitation. Brad was there too, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He tried to make a... I just didn't know what to say to... Your situation. Elena looked at him, then signed. I translated without softening anything. I'm not a situation. I'm a person. Brad's face went tight. Elena kept going. You don't need to know ASL to be decent. You just need to remember the person in front of you has dignity. No one spoke. Mark apologized first. His wife followed. Brad finally managed a real apology without the smirk this time. I accept. But I won't make myself smaller so you feel less ashamed. I looked at her and felt something settle deep in my chest. I didn't love her because she needed protecting. I loved her because she was strong in ways that didn't need to be loud. When we stepped outside afterward, the same awning where everything had started was waiting for us. Rain tapped steadily on the metal. Elena turned to me, eyes clear. She signed. This time I didn't need you to stand in front of me. I signed back. I know, but I still want to stand beside you. She smiled then. The real one. The one that reached her eyes and made something in me go quiet and certain. Then she rose up on her toes and kissed me. It wasn't careful or hesitant. It was the kind of kiss that said she had finally stopped. I kissed her back under that awning with rain falling around us and the city lights blurring in the wet street. And for the first time since I'd met her, I stopped worrying about what came next. I just held on. 1 year later, we got married in the backyard of my workshop. Not in a fancy hotel. Not with an expensive dress or a string quartet. Just 30 people who mattered. Warm string lights hanging from the trees, and white flowers tied to the wooden arch I'd built from reclaimed lumber. The air smelled like sawdust and late summer roses. My mother sat in the front row, eyes wet, hands moving constantly. Beautiful, so beautiful. Elena walked toward me in a simple ivory dress, the small carved piece of maple I'd made hanging on a thin leather cord around her neck. Milo walked beside her wearing a tiny bow tie, looking far too serious for a dog. When she reached me, she signed. You clean up well, Carpenter. I signed back. You keep stealing my heart. Our ceremony didn't start with music. It started with silence, but it wasn't the empty kind. It was the fullest silence I'd ever... We signed our vows to each other. I took both of Elena's hands and signed every word slowly, making sure she could see every movement. I choose you, today, tomorrow, and every quiet day after. I don't want to be the man who protected you for one night. I want to be the man who chooses you in every ordinary day that follows. Elena's eyes filled, but her hand stayed steady. I choose you. In the noise and in the silence, in the scars and in the strength. I used to think I would be a different kind of wife. Now I understand. I don't have to be like anyone else to be loved completely. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, I didn't kiss her right away. I signed. May I? Elena laughed, shoulders shaking. Always. I kissed her under the wooden arch while 30 people clapped, and Milo barked once like he was officially approving the whole thing. After the wedding, we moved into a small house 10 minutes from the shop. I fixed the porch, built bookshelves, and made a dining table from black walnut. Elena painted the kitchen a soft yellow because she said rainy days needed a place that pretended to have sunlight. We installed a flashing doorbell, a vibrating alarm clock under the pillow, and lights that blinked when someone knocked. Small things, quiet things, things that let our house speak our language. Every evening we sat on the porch. I told her about the pieces I was building. She told me about the hospital, about the kids who called her Nurse Superhero. Some nights she was too tired to sign. I just sat beside her and placed my hand near hers. That was enough. We still went to Bluebird Cafe every Wednesday. Sarah had put a small plaque on table 6 that read, "A place where someone listened, not with ears, but with heart." Elena said it was a little cheesy, but she always touched the plaque before she sat down. Years later, when people asked how we met, Elena usually smiled and signed. A group of people set us up very badly, and I always added, "Good thing they underestimated both of us." The truth is, that night they thought Elena was a test. They thought I would get uncomfortable, pull away, or act like she was a burden. They didn't know that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the only one who makes the whole room worth remembering. Elena was never the broken girl they saw. She was the woman who taught me that silence has a voice, that love doesn't have to be loud to be deep, that a different life isn't a lesser life. And me, the guy who thought he only knew how to work with wood, finally learned that the most lasting thing in the world isn't the table I build or the house I fix. It's trust. A trust built slowly, one sign at a time, one look at a time, one choice to stay when other people chose to leave. And if I could go back to that first night, back to the exact moment Brad asked if Elena was really my type, I would still give the same answer. No. Because Elena was never normal. She was the only